saying that we're starting. And if that's true, I can go over to my Facebook feed and refresh, and I should be able to see us there. Hello, everyone. I'm going to assume that I am starting. There I am. Okay, verified. We are live, and I am so sorry for the delay. There was a little bit of a technical difficulty, but we're here now, and I am incredibly thankful to be joined by three amazing researchers who I will introduce in a short little bit. We are here to talk about climate change, the coronavirus pandemic, science and society, and how we can better come together in facing these great challenges that we're facing. Part of the reason why I'm hosting this discussion is because I started to see a lot of crossovers between society's response to the coronavirus pandemic and the way we have also responded to human-induced global warming. The stakes are high in both. Jobs and livelihoods are on the line. Science has been sort of framed or perceived as being against societal advancement in some circles. And in both cases, fallacy arguments have really been an effective tool for hijacking our shared understanding of the science and how we can incorporate science to better move forward together as a society. So sort of creating these unnecessary divides, in my opinion. So I'll speak in really personal terms in saying that I myself have really struggled to know how to speak up about this harm when I witness it, because sometimes my perspective is simply not wanted, and it's not, and that's okay. Before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the United States. A couple of my guests today are up in Canada. But I think collectively, I think it's fair to say that we are familiar with a very power over dynamic when it comes to relationships. I know I have been indoctrinated in that type of culture and have noticed in myself that ability to just power over in certain, and this could be intellectual power, this is physical power, this is influential power, sometimes marginalizing, using influential power to outcast people or to build communities by othering other people. So there's lots of ways that we can power over, and from what I've seen and experienced, we are so familiar with this mentality and this way of being that sometimes it's even hard to pick up on when we're doing it. And I think collectively we've reached this level of fed upness with being powered over. And what's interesting is it's multiple people talking about this being fed up in different ways, whether it's being fed up with being powered over intellectually, being fed up with being powered over politically. There's lots of physically also with the Black Lives Matter movement. There's so many ways in which people are expressing being fed up, and yet moving forward, it's really going to take us understanding how we experience and contribute to this ourselves. So I mentioned that today because we're about to embark on a topic that doesn't just include one charged topic. We're not just talking about the coronavirus pandemic or climate change, but or politics, right? Nothing charged here. We're going to mash it all up together. I'm not seeing myself streaming, but yeah, it seems to be streaming okay. So I'm going to trust everything is going okay. Anyways, yeah, so we're mashing up these multiple charged topics. And I just I want to put it out there that if anyone that out in the audience is really not wanting to receive information from science and scientists, that's okay. We're here for you. You could always come back later. There's no needing to shove information down people's throats or shove our opinion down your throat, whatever. We're just here to offer our perspective and voices, and you are welcome at the table, and we hope you'll join. That said, I have this live stream up and going, and I'm watching my comments. And so if anyone has something that they would like to ask our speakers, that's great. So introducing, I'm first going to start with Peter Berman. Hello, Peter. You're coming onto the stream now. There you are. Hello.
Hello. Nice to join you. Thanks.
Welcome. So Peter Berman is the director of University of British Columbia School of Population and Public Health. And I'm very pleased to have you on board. So you are co-leading a project with Max Cameron, who I'm going to also bring on, to look at how different government systems are responding to the coronavirus pandemic. Peter Berman brings his wealth of knowledge on health economics, and Max is a political scientist specializing in democracy. And we also have Daniel Sitzo, who I'm bringing on now as well. Daniel is professor and department head at Purdue University with a specialization in atmospheric chemistry. So thank you all for being here. Before we get started, I also want to highlight that even though we're talking about coronavirus and climate change and science and society, there are some really fundamental differences between the two. So, you know, I have, just to give a little bit of context, I can't show that. So with climate change, climate change, the science has been around for a long time, starting with Svante Arrhenius in the 1800s. And we've developed our understanding over since the 1890s, right? So climate science stands on the shoulders of lots of information. The macro scale is pretty well locked down. We're understanding the dynamical realm and the micro scale. But there's been a lot of lead in scientific understanding preceding impacts. Whereas with the coronavirus pandemic, science is evolving lockstep with the pandemic and societal impacts. So two very big differences, but even despite those differences, we have in both seen this influence of politics, fallacy, and how people are understanding or not even willing to understand the science. So, Peter, I was hoping that maybe you could speak a little bit to this sense of living in uncertainty with science and what you're seeing with the coronavirus pandemic.
Sure, and I think that it's important to kind of acknowledge that there's a continuum around understanding the science and deriving certain conclusions which govern an individual's actions or a collective action, a society's actions, and the institutions we've set up for collective action. So, I think it's interesting to consider that science usually science is usually very careful about making absolutely hard and fast, black and white statements about facts, okay? The model we have in science is that we have hypotheses about the world, and these lead to theories, and we test these theories with evidence, and then we conclude based on a preponderance of evidence that a theory is good at explaining what we're observing in the world. But sometimes we change these theories as evidence changes and hypothesis changes, right? So the things that people thought were facts a couple of centuries ago, many of them we don't think are facts today because we think we have better theories and evidence. And we should understand that that can change again. Okay, and that's not to say that what science tells us is not meaningful or a useful guide to action. It's and many of us in science believe it's better than the alternative, which is often just to make suppositions and guesswork or have blind, unsupported belief. Okay, so I think that we need to really recognize that we do live with uncertainty. I think this has been really true around COVID-19. We've seen there are many things that we are observing that we have been learning over time. Also, the reality changes over time because this is a biological agent that's interacting with human beings, right? And human beings live in different settings and so on. So what might be true in New York City 4 months ago might not be true in rural South New Mexico tomorrow in the same sense because people are interacting in certain ways. Okay, so I feel that it's really important that we try to convey to the public that it's not a simple black and white thing, 0-1 thing, true or not true. We make decisions based on our best ability to draw conclusions that we think are generalizable and correct from the available evidence and the theories we have. I'll stop there. That's enough.
Great. And you bring up actually something that I think is worth pointing out, which is that there are a couple different definitions of theory. And there's theory in the sense of hypothesis, which is in the way that you're using it, where we have a hypothesis and we test it, and then there can be good evidence to support that hypothesis, but then the evidence can change and we need to look for new hypotheses. And then there's the theory of greenhouse warming, which is something that has been, which I tend to think of as theory. It's something that's been substantively tested very rigorously with lots of deep meaning and understanding. So typically there's two ways of using theory, and I just want to flag that the way that you're using it right now is more of the sort of hypothesis sense. Yes?
And I wouldn't draw that distinction quite that way.
Okay.
So I think that we use hypothesis and testing hypothesis to build theory, which is a stronger set of observations about relationships in the world. Okay. In the case of greenhouse warming, it's a physical relationship. We can test that accumulating certain gases in the atmosphere has a physical effect, right, on temperature, surface temperature, and so on. So that's a pretty robust theory, I would say, and then there are other theories that are not as robust, depending on their foundations. So let's hear what others say about the way I framed this.
I'd like to, if I could, make a distinction between scientific knowledge, which is the knowledge that is developed and curated by the scientific community, and practical wisdom, what Aristotle called phronesis, which is how we know what we should do in a given situation. It's a kind of the practical how-to, as opposed to knowing why something is the case. We can make a distinction between theories that tell us, that explain how the world works, and contrast that with the kind of knowledge that's often grounded in experience that tells us what's a wise course of action to pursue at a given point in time. And you referred earlier, Rachel, to this idea of power over, but there's also the power to act collectively. So how do we get people, how do we engage in collective deliberation to reach decisions that are wise decisions that help us to achieve collective action or to address a common problem that we face? And that's where practical wisdom comes in. And one of the critical intermediating sort of functions between theory on the one hand is scientific knowledge, and figuring out how to put that theory to work or figure out how to do something is the professions. So we think about the professions as, doctors, nurses, lawyers, judges, but also teachers, firefighters. There are people who have been steeped in the professional in scientific knowledge. They have a grasp of scientific knowledge and evidence. They're reading the scientific journals, but they're also perhaps clinicians working with individual patients and dealing with novel problems. And something like the coronavirus is a good example of a kind of a novel problem that we're learning about experientially, as well as we're now seeing the results of scientific studies. And so we turn to professionals to help us as members of the public to make informed choices. So if you ask, how should we decide whether to wear a mask or not? Or should we travel or practice social distancing? My inclination is to, in the first instance, consult with professionals. What can they tell us about what present knowledge has to offer? And that will always be advice that will be specific to our individual circumstances. And what works for Sweden might be different for British Columbia or Washington or Massachusetts.
So I love that you bring up that there's these many ways of knowing, and I think that's really core to some of the friction that we're experiencing in society, is people feeling like their way of knowing is not being valued to the degree that they would like it to be valued. And I see this often with this sense of not wanting to turn to professionals. So like for myself, when I look to new information coming out about the coronavirus, I'm not a doctor. I'm not trained in any health. Well, I should rephrase that. I'm a doctor of oceanography. I'm not a public health, that kind of doctor. So my knowledge on the human stuff is limited. So when I see something come out like this study from Denmark, which is showing that, that the headline says study shows that masks don't protect from the coronavirus. When I see that, I have this process now as someone who, that's outside my oceanography realm. I having this background in oceanography where I've seen how information can be misleading, I've developed this methodology where I first go to the paper, I look at the methods to see what exactly was being tested, to see like how to parse that information. So in this study, questions, I just start asking questions like, was everybody in the household of the group that needed to wear masks? Was everybody wearing masks in that household? Because in Denmark, less than 5% of the people wear masks. So did that study make everybody in the household wear masks? Did Peter? Yes.
I just want to use that example just as a nice contrast. Here's what the newspaper headline said. Face masks do not, in capitals, protect wearer from coronavirus. Danish study finds. Here's the title of the study. Effectiveness of adding a mask recommendation to other public measures to prevent SARS-CoV-2 infection in Danish mask wearers, a randomized controlled trial. So you could see that the title of the actual document, which shared the results, didn't say what the headline said.
Yeah,
that's a great example, I think, of the problem. I mean, the paper gives a very technical, detailed analysis, and does what you want to do because you're a trained scientist, right? But the newspaper article didn't try to do that at all.
Right.
So,
right. And so this is knowing your source, right? Knowing your information source. Are we looking at a news article? If so, maybe dig deeper, which is where I went, right? Like go get the primary literature. And then even with the primary literature, then there's understanding the ingredients. What went in to make the souffle? Is it savory or is it sweet? I don't know until you look at the ingredients, right? And with this study, I haven't read through it entirely carefully. I just keep coming up with questions. And I think this is something that we need to be really good at as information consumers, is like, well, what other explanations are there? Did the person who was required to wear a mask as part of the study, were they sleeping with someone in the same household with other people who didn't have a mask? And were they wearing a mask while they were sleeping? All of these little things.
Yeah.
I think in some ways we're deeply conflicted about what we want to hear from the professionals, from public health officials in particular. On the one hand, we're skeptical. We're increasingly skeptical of professionals and professional knowledge and expertise, in part because we're so awash in information. So we have multiple sources of information. We have a hard time parsing what's true, what's not, what's legitimate, what's not, what has scientific credibility, and what doesn't. And so we're increasingly skeptical, and that can be a good thing. But at the same time, we want clear rules. We want to be told what's the right thing to do. And we hope that scientists will answer that question for us. And scientists, and this is the point, can never answer that question for us, because we know climate change is happening, but how do we respond to it? That's a political question. We know that the virus is out there and we need to practice social distancing, but how do we do that? We have to figure that out. And that's why I think professionals are incredibly crucial, even though we don't have the knowledge to be able to assess how good they are. And that's part of our doubt about professions. Plus there's professional malpractice that we see in all kinds of different quarters, and that makes us nervous as well. But the reality is there aren't hard and fast rules. The knowledge is evolving. And so what it takes to do the right thing is judgment. And my point is that judgment is best exercised through both public deliberation, so as much information and knowledge sharing as possible, but also in the relationships that we have with professionals. So my answer is talk to your doctor. If you want to know, or get on talk to the nursing phone line in BC and say, okay, I'm having a party, people are over, these are the conditions, what do I do? And you can get helpful advice that way. There won't always be a one-size-fits-all answer, but we can get better at exercising judgment as long as what we're trying to do is approach the matter conscientiously. We want good results. How can we use existing knowledge in the best possible way to protect ourselves and our communities? And if we take that approach, I think that we can get better and better at this, and that's important.
I totally agree. I'm aware of the time. We had a late start because of technical issues. Peter, I know that you wanted to end this around at 45. Are you good staying on a little longer, or would you like? Okay, great. So Dan, I really want to give you a chance to speak to some of the observations that you've made too, as a climate scientist interfacing with how people look at information. I'm not sure if this is something that we share, but I think we do, where there's this sense of it's just a simple graph. Why do I need to look to professionals? As one example, I don't know. I would just like to hear your thoughts.
Well, first off, Rachel, thanks so much for having me on again. And it's a pleasure. And I'm really glad that you are hosting an important discussion like this. Just sort of riffing off of what Max and Peter said. One thing that's been often repeated over the last several months is that the group least surprised by the misconceptions and inaccuracies going around about COVID are climate scientists, because we've been living through this for the past 2 or 3 decades now. And you started out by mentioning some of the long history of over 100 years of climate science. And I think there's a couple of things, there's what we can do as educators beyond the classroom, beyond our students. and one of the things that I think that we're all fighting against in climate, as well as folks that are involved in the pandemic right now, is a lack of understanding by folks that are trying to make decisions about it. And Peter and Max both mentioned aspects of this, but one thing that I think we need to realize is that there's a lot of folks that haven't had a science class since maybe high school. They might be 40 years, 50 years old now. So it's been decades, and yet they're trying to make an educated decision, and they're really trying to do their best. And so, that's, I think, something that a lot of us do is we teach college age students, but we also try to do outreach activities, what we call adult STEM education, trying to bring folks that might not have been in the classroom for 20 or 30 years up to speed. And I think when we do that, what we're really trying to do is fight against a lot of misconceptions. And so there's this common saying that, scientific information has to be peer reviewed. It may take years, whereas disinformation travels at the speed of a mouse click. So if I want to put a falsehood out there, and maybe I have a vested interest in doing so, maybe I derive some type of financial or political gain from saying something isn't occurring that is, I can just hit that mouse and send that out. And the people that might want to hear that will pick that up very quickly. But for us as scientists to get the correct information out there, it may take us years. And Peter was, bringing up this idea of a theory and then testing that theory, perhaps revising that theory. This is the old scientific method. And so I think that's really what we as scientists are fighting against. We're trying to fight on a level playing field, but it really isn't level because misconceptions travel so quickly. And really the ultimate thing that we have to do is have an educated public, and have people making the correct decisions. And maybe just following up on one other thing that Max said, which is this idea of the difference between science and policy and how these things get kind of mashed up. We as scientists are responsible for getting information out there, but that has to get turned over to policymakers to make decisions. So, we can provide information, but what those mandates actually look like in terms of wearing masks or changes that we have to our economy to tackle climate change are really something that are beyond scientists' control. But we often bear the brunt of that, when those policies are enacted. And so also, I think making the public aware of the differences in those things, science versus policy, is important moving forward in both of these areas.
Yeah, and I really like how you pointed to that challenge of fighting against the spread of misinformation, how it can go at the click of a mouse. I mean, essentially, this. Well, okay, so I feel like this is sort of maybe a crude analogy, but when yeah, I don't know. We have a health economist on the line and a climate scientist, so I'm gonna do a mashup of the two and relate. When we want, okay, so if we're wanting to have sex with a lot of people, the best way to prevent transmitting STDs is to wear a condom, or you abstain. You don't have sex with a lot of people and you abstain. When I hear this issue of misinformation, it's sort of like getting a disease in your beliefs or your mind state that is then really difficult to undo. And I think what we're advocating in this is to put on your critical thinking cap or your mental condom, like make sure it's snugged on really well, that intellectual condom of yours, so that you can explore your curiosity about these different scientific realms that maybe we don't have the background to explore or know what the history of those science realms are. And so we need this intellectual condom firmly in place so that we don't spread misinformation around in our community. A really crude analogy perhaps, but this is what we get when we have health experts and climate scientists on the line. I'm gonna go there. And on that note, it's 4:55. Thank you all so much for taking the time for being here today. Does anybody want to give a parting message to our community?
I just say very briefly, I like Dan's point about, look at what interests are behind what people are doing as well. One of the things that's so clear in the climate area is a lot of the climate denial is funded by big oil, right? And it's really worth trying to cultivate a bit of your antenna, your capacity to sort of pick up what are sources of unreliable information, what are the interests that might be behind it. I find that very helpful myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just close by saying, there's a lot of folks out there that are trying to do things like adult STEM education. It might be at your public library, it might be an outreach from your local community college or university. And so people that want to find more, please go after those resources. There's so many groups out there that are trying to get information out. And they're practically begging people to listen. So please make use of those resources.
Yeah, I think my challenge with that though is I just see a lot of information fatigue, which I think is part of our challenge. Really, is information fatigue. So, yeah.
Otherwise known as intellectual laziness.
You could say it that way. All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here today.
Thank you, Rachel.
Bye.